It's a great pleasure and a particular honor to have been asked to deliver the keynote address for this symposium, marking the resumption of ISP's popular TV series. I would like to focus today on a couple of major questions concerning Myanmar's geopolitical outlook and how relations with the global community could affect its future. When Myanmar embarked on the road to democracy 10 years ago, it was the tentative beginning of a long journey that opened the country rather suddenly to a degree of engagement and dependence on the outside world that it had not experienced during the long years of military rule. This has not been an easy journey, but for many reasons, the new generation emerging during this period is much more grounded in the international community than previous generations were. I believe they have a better understanding than preceding generations of the fact that Myanmar cannot achieve progress in a vacuum, but must constantly adapt to its external environment in order to succeed. The most immediate external pressure on Myanmar today comes from its giant neighbor to the east. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, China has developed a clear ambition to ascend to the summit of global power, beginning with dominance of Asia. This has immediate existential consequences for Myanmar, more so than any other outside force influencing the country today. China's route westward proceeds directly through Myanmar, promising inevitably to draw Myanmar into the Chinese orbit and risking Myanmar's future control over its own economy and its political options. The outlines of this strategy are already clearly visible in the comprehensive Chinese designs for the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor and the tremendous pressure being brought on Myanmar by the Chinese leadership to proceed rapidly with major projects. Beyond this formal strategy, China already has a wide variety of investments in Myanmar, many of which are beyond either government's control, particularly in the contested periphery of the country. Before addressing this challenge, let me first share a few thoughts on the future course of U.S. relations with China and the implications this could have for Myanmar. In the past couple of years, U.S. relations with China have deteriorated rapidly, not so much as a result of U.S. strategy or policy, but more as the consequence of increasingly aggressive, even belligerent, Chinese behavior in its foreign policy and relations with the United States. There is now strong bipartisan consensus in Washington that China has become more like an enemy than a friend, hacking into the internet to steal technology and personal information, running dangerously aggressive military maneuvers against U.S. forces in international waters in the Pacific, closing down bilateral dialogue between academic and policy institutes, expanding its military forces and bases into South Asia and Africa and so on. The list keeps growing, and I'm not even including the restrictions Beijing has placed on its own citizens. Whatever the outcome of the U.S. elections in November, therefore, I expect U.S.-China relations to remain in deep freeze for the foreseeable future, even if some of the harsher rhetoric subsides. Let me also mention that the recent statement on Facebook from the U.S. Embassy in Yangon was part of an ASEAN-wide initiative in which each embassy in an ASEAN capital, each U.S. embassy, was asked to release a statement about negative Chinese activity in that country to demonstrate the breadth of growing Chinese pressure on Southeast Asia. It would be a mistake to conclude that this initiative was aimed at Myanmar alone, because up to this point, nonetheless, the downward spiral in U.S.-Chinese relations seems to have had little direct bearing on Myanmar. U.S. policy toward Myanmar remains on a steady course, and Myanmar has not become a battleground in U.S.-China relations, nor is it likely to be one. Because the U.S. and China have quite different interests at stake in Myanmar, it is difficult to posit a zero-sum competition between the two in this country. But the U.S. remains concerned about potential damage to Myanmar's political and economic reforms that might result from a single-minded Chinese pursuit of its interests here. Indeed, the negative influences on Myanmar emanating from China are very serious. Therefore, with U.S. interests in Myanmar centered predominantly on building a strong, vibrant, and prosperous democracy in Myanmar, U.S. policy continues to focus on the task of strengthening Myanmar's democratic and economic institutions to help resist and counteract damaging Chinese activities. We recognize that Chinese investment in Myanmar's infrastructure can be very beneficial when it is designed and executed to meet Myanmar's, and not only China's, best interests. The policies developed in Naypyidaw for managing major investments are excellent and should be supported by all Myanmar citizens who will be affected by Chinese investment. Unfortunately, this is far from the reality on the ground, where there is as yet little knowledge of the policy. This brings me to the heart of my message today. I believe that Myanmar's most serious weakness against foreign incursion lies in its own failure so far to reckon with its internal divisions and the deep corruption that has come from decades of military rule. Persistent ethnic and religious divisions, communal tensions, and conflict are prevalent throughout the country in various forms, creating a multitude of opportunities for foreign influences to play one group off against another. Large areas of the country have been designated for administration by armed forces, including the Tatmadaw, the armed ethnic organizations, the border guard forces, and a variety of militias, who are not subject to the laws that govern civilians. This alternative economy under armed control is inherently weak and easily corrupted by foreign investors and their agents, interested only in raiding the country's resources and willfully despoiling the land. The criminal gambling networks moving into Cayenne State are a striking example, but they represent only the tip of the iceberg and the latest iteration of this threat. Although criticism of the 2008 Constitution has focused particularly on certain clauses limiting elected civilian leadership, the most serious failure of the deeply flawed Constitution is its opening section that decrees a permanent place to all the structures of government, the personnel, and the legal and other instruments of government created by the previous military dictatorship. Elected civilian leaders have struggled mightily for 10 years to overcome this enormous handicap, thwarted every step of the way by the malicious intervention of military influences implanted and empowered throughout the country's political, economic, judicial, and security structures. In fact, I'm surprised at the degree of political and economic reform the elected government has managed to achieve against such strong military resistance. Of course, I have the perspective of more than 20 years, and I can tell you that the Myanmar of today is definitely not the country it was 20 years ago. It's much better. The clear bifurcation of Myanmar's government between civilian and military control, however, is a terrible weakness for the country, making it possible for foreign investors to game national investment policy and regulation by playing one side off against the other, by finding different openings in various ministries to bombard decision-making bodies with requests for project approval, and by finding pockets of corruption in government bureaucracy willing to approve projects without regard to regulatory rules. Under these conditions of governance, the excellent policies developed by the NLD government for managing major investments are proving very difficult to implement by government alone, because there are so many potentially subversive elements present in the divided government and the dual economy. It is my strong conviction that civil society and carefully directed community organization could provide the answer to this dilemma, both in urban centers and in the more remote areas of the country that are targeted by major investors. It seems to me that if civil society organizations and local communities were empowered with a clear understanding of the sound policy requirements developed by Naypyidaw for project approval, if they could engage with government to develop institutions to support these policies, they could help to force compliance with policy at the local level by insisting on full and adequate consultations with the affected community before a project could proceed. A solid alliance between civil society and government behind these policies would be particularly powerful. It is critically important, therefore, for civil society to connect with government, to find ways to partner with the government to develop effective policies, regulations, land management, access to resources, and means of earning a living. And government, for its part, must learn to interact productively with the people it is meant to serve. There must be two-way traffic between civil society and government in Myanmar if true democracy is to be achieved. And I include business in this equation. In fact, the Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan provides the perfect roadmap for these relationships, but it has not received the attention it richly deserves. Another serious problem confronting Myanmar and the global community is the lasting international horror produced by the criminal attack on the Rakhine Muslim minority in 2017 and earlier, which lingers on in the crowded Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh and the Kaman IDP camps in Rakhine. It is a sad fact of life that the image of Myanmar as a serious human rights violator will continue to plague and impede its relations with large parts of the global community, not only in the West, but also in Africa and the Middle East, until Myanmar society is able to face this problem directly, institute effective accountability, and find a means of welcoming its Rohingya minority back into the country on an equal footing with the rest of the population. This is the ultimate test of Myanmar's ability to transform its ethnic and religious diversity from a serious national weakness into a major source of national strength. I believe the younger generation in Myanmar has the intellectual capacity and worldly experience to understand that celebration of diversity brings enormous resilience and creativity to democratic society. The current generation of elected leadership in Myanmar has devoted a lifetime to fighting for the country's democratic future, and they have suffered greatly for this at the hands of cruel military dictatorship. They are still fighting this battle today because it is far from over. However, the time has come, in fact, it is now urgent, for a new generation to assume the leadership. It is time for Myanmar's struggle for democracy to adjust to the requirements of the 21st century world. It is time for the younger generation to begin seizing the leading role in civil society, in government, and in business to shake up the old order, to replace the old prejudices and social structures with a new inclusive national identity based on an appreciation for diversity, and to build sustainable democratic institutions that will protect Myanmar's independence from foreign domination. I have faith that you are all up to this task, as impossible as it may sound. Thank you very much for listening.